Relax and listen to the voice. Welcome to Terrifying Tales, Volume 1. Here we go. One night I went to the theater to see a movie. There was a horror film festival about classic zombie movies. Because I had nothing to do, I decided to go in and check out the block. I paid for my ticket and bought a bag of chips and a large soft drink at the counter. Then I made my way into the darkened theater and found a seat. The theater was almost empty. There were only a few other people watching the movies. In the row behind me, there was an old man, and sitting to my right, 3 seats down, there was a very large, obese man. The lights went out completely, and the movie started. I got comfortable in my seat and began munching on my chips and sipping my drink. The movie was actually quite scary. After a few minutes, I heard a loud, irritating laugh. Looking to my right, I saw the obese man bouncing around in his seat and laughing uncontrollably. He threw his head back and let out a loud guffaw at every horrifying scene. It was extremely annoying, and honestly, it began to get quite unnerving. A few minutes later, the old man in the row behind us leaned forward and placed his hand on the obese man's shoulder. "Excuse me, sir," he said. "You are disturbing me with your laughter. Can you please be quieter?" The obese man scowled and turned around. In a rude manner, he refused to be quiet and told the old man to mind his own business. He said, quote unquote, "Did you pay to watch the movie or to watch me?" I would have liked to have stood up and told the obese man to shut up, but I just didn't have the guts. A few minutes later, I was sitting there watching the movie when I noticed that I didn't hear the man's annoying laugh anymore. I glanced over at him and I saw that he was asleep. He was slumped in his chair with his head back and his mouth open. Ugh, I hope he doesn't start snoring now, I thought to myself as I continued to munch on my chips and sip on my drink. After a while, I happened to glance at the man again. He was still sitting in the same position, completely motionless. While I was looking at him, I reached for my cup again, pulled it out of the holder, and the lid popped off, causing the cup to fall down on the floor. I pulled my cell phone out, and I shined my light, picking up the cardboard cup and the straw. While I was shining my light down on the floor, I noticed that there was a dark patch beneath the obese man's seat. It kind of looked like a puddle spreading out beneath him. After I'd gathered my cup, I sat back up and stared at the man, and as I was doing so, the screen got brighter, and for a few moments I could see clearly. I gasped in horror. The obese man's neck had been sliced open from ear to ear, and blood was dripping down his front and forming a pool on the floor. All of a sudden, on the movie screen, a zombie appeared out of nowhere and attacked someone. I let out a high-pitched scream and almost jumped out of my seat. Just then, I felt a hand on my shoulder, and a voice said, "Excuse me, sir. You're disturbing me with your screams and your constant munching. Can you please be quiet?" I nervously laughed and apologized. I saw the man nod his head as he slipped the blade back into his front coat pocket. Bill and Mabel disregarded the tall tales they heard from their neighbors. They didn't believe in ghosts and weren't about to start to now, just because some silly neighbors believed in the paranormal. But Mabel was curious about the history of the house, so she contacted the real estate agent and told him that she had heard odd stories about the house being haunted. The realtor said that by law, he should have disclosed the history of the house. Apparently, there had been a string of horrible murders committed in the house years before by an insane serial killer. The murders were only discovered after the killer had died. He had been smoking in bed when he fell asleep and accidentally dropped a cigarette onto his bed sheets. His bed caught fire and he burned alive without ever waking up. His corpse had lain undiscovered in the house for years. Eventually, the police had broken in and found his decomposing body lying in bed. They dug up the garden and found the remains of his victims. This story unnerved Mabel, and she began having nightmares about the killer. She told her husband that she was beginning to believe that the stories of the haunting could be true. Mabel frequently complained about the feeling that someone was in the room during the night, and sometimes she would wake suddenly during the night, convinced that she had felt cold, bony hands touching her. Bill thought that Mabel was just being silly and having terrible nightmares, but to keep his wife happy, he promised to stay up all night and keep watch over her. Bill was confident that if she woke up after feeling the cold, bony hands and nobody was there, she would realize that it was all in her imagination. True to his word, Billy stayed up the whole night. Around midnight, the room began to feel uncomfortably warm, and he was gripped by the feeling of an overwhelming thirst. Leaving Mabel sleeping softly, he went downstairs to the kitchen to get a glass of water. Upstairs in the darkened bedroom, Mabel awoke with a start. She heard footsteps outside the door, and then someone came into the room. She assumed that it was her husband, Bill. She leaned over in bed to give him a kiss, but her lips touched something cold and bony. From downstairs, Bill heard the most horrible, blood-curdling scream coming from the room that he shared with Mabel. He rushed upstairs, burst through the door, and screamed in horror at what he had found. Mabel's dead body lay stretched out on the bed. Her face was twisted in an expression of utter terror. Bill grabbed his wife's body and shook her, trying to revive her, trying to help her. After a short time, he rushed downstairs and called the police. Several months after this had happened, Bill had finally gone back upstairs and tried to go to sleep in the bedroom that he shared with his now dead wife, Mabel. He laid down, trying not to think of the horrible things that he had seen in this room, and somehow, throughout the night, he was able to fall asleep. Strangely enough, Bill had sunken into a deep sleep and was finally sleeping peacefully until around midnight. He awoke again, feeling very thirsty, and he went downstairs and got a glass of water. When he went back upstairs, he was almost frozen in place when he saw a large lump in the bed. It began to move. Bill ran over to the bed and ripped off the bed sheets. Upon doing so, the ghost of his wife, Mabel, sat up in the bed. She had tears in her eyes, and her cheeks were hollow and sunken. The dark form of another man crouched beside her. A terrible, skeletal man with the face of a desiccated corpse. The skeletal man clutched Mabel's head in his cold, bony grasp and forced her to kiss him. Shimmering, ghostly tears streamed down Mabel's face. In her hand, she held the biggest knife Bill had ever seen. "Didn't you promise, Billy? Didn't you promise me? Till death do us part! You promised!" screamed Mabel as she floated towards her frightened and paralyzed husband. There was a young boy named Melvin who always had a smile on his face. A lot of people assumed that he was, as they called them back then, a little simple-minded. At school, he was always bullied by his classmates. They thought that he was stupid, and they delighted in playing nasty tricks and malicious pranks upon him. Despite being the butt of all their jokes, Melvin still tagged along with the other boys, hoping internally that someday they would accept him. All he desired in life was their friendship, but they just continued to reject him and treated him like a fool. While he was constantly bullied by most of the kids in his class, the ringleader of the group was a boy named Tyler. He was especially mean to the smaller boy and never missed an opportunity to humiliate Melvin in front of the entire school. Tyler often punched and kicked Melvin just for fun. Sometimes he even encouraged other kids to beat Melvin up just so he could watch and laugh. Whenever the other kids called him names, taunted him, mocked him, or played tricks on him, Melvin would just smile or give a weak laugh. He tried to pretend he was unaffected by the merciless treatment that he received. However, his smile was like a mask. Behind it, his heart was broken. On a random Saturday night, Tyler and his friends were gathered in the center of town. When they spotted Melvin walking home from school, Tyler told them he had come up with an amazing prank to play on the boy. "Just play along," he told his friends, and then he ran over, grabbed Melvin by the scruff of his neck, and dragged him over to the group. "Tonight, we're gonna dig up a corpse," Tyler announced, "and you're going to help us, Melvin." "Oh, come on, guys," replied Melvin. "Please don't joke around about stuff like that." "Oh, nobody's joking," said Tyler. "Remember old Mrs. Jefferson who died last year? Well, tonight, we're going to the cemetery. We're going to dig her up and leave her in front of the school to freak everyone out. Now, we're going to do the digging, but we need somebody to do the carrying. And guess what? We've chosen you, Melvin." "Oh, give me a break, Tyler," pleaded Melvin. "You can't ask me to do something like that." "Oh, I'm not asking you. I'm telling you," said Tyler in a threatening voice. "You'll do what you're told. After dinner tonight, you're going to meet us inside the cemetery. If you don't show up, we'll give you the beating of your life tomorrow in school. And also, don't tell anyone about this, or you can consider yourself a dead man." As darkness fell that night, Tyler met his friends at the cemetery. They gathered around as he explained exactly what he had planned. He was going to disguise himself as a corpse and hide in a graveyard among the headstones. He opened his bag and showed them the costume and the latex mask that he had brought with him. "When he gets here, you guys send him into the cemetery and tell him to find old Miss Jefferson's grave. There's a freshly dug grave in the middle of the cemetery. I'm going to be hiding in it, and when he gets close enough, I'll grab him and drag him into the grave with me. I'm going to scare him so bad, he'll probably have a heart attack." The other boys thought that it was a great plan, and they couldn't hide their excitement. Tyler got into his costume and went into the cemetery to hide. He climbed down into the open grave and waited patiently. "This is going to be the best prank ever," he said to himself as he pulled on his latex mask. Roughly a half an hour later, Melvin finally arrived and met the other boys at the entrance to the graveyard. He was smiling as usual, but in his eyes, the boys could see that he was actually quite scared. He had his hands in his pockets and was visibly shaking. The other boys greeted him and sent him into the graveyard and told him to find the grave. As Melvin walked deeper into the cemetery, the darkness seemed to close in all around him. The only light that he had was from the screen of his cell phone as he held it up to try to light his way. Melvin walked between the tombstones, his shoulders slouched and his hands trembling. Every little sound that he heard caused him to jump a little in fear or to shake in trepidation. Finally, he reached the middle of the cemetery and arrived at the freshly dug grave. As he cautiously approached the headstone to read the inscription, a hand came out of the grave and grabbed him by the ankle. Melvin let out a cry, and suddenly the hand dragged him down into the grave. Melvin lay there on the bottom of the hole, coughing and spluttering, wiping the mud from his eyes, and he saw a horrible sight. There was a corpse standing over him. Its face was pale and wizened. Its eyes were sunken and its skull was cracked. Melvin struggled to his feet and pulled a large knife out of his pocket. Seeing this, Tyler became horrified. "Wait, don't stab me!" he shouted, retreating quickly. "Why not?" asked Melvin. In a panic, Tyler fell backwards and became tangled in his costume. Melvin towered over him, brandishing the knife. As Tyler looked up at him, he saw the blade glinting in the moonlight. "Wait, you don't understand!" Tyler cried, desperately tearing off the latex mask. "It's me, Tyler! We were just playing a prank on you!" Melvin continued to advance on him, clutching the knife tightly and raising it above his head. "You're the one who doesn't understand," said Michael. His voice was suddenly cold and his face was twisted in rage. "I knew that it was a prank all along." There was a man named Panfilo who built a house in a remote Mexican village. There were 2 old women who lived near him, and sometimes he would go over to their house to play cards. Their names were Pilar and Fefe. They were tall, thin women with pale, narrow faces and dark circles around their eyes. It almost looked as if they never slept. The 2 old women were sisters, and they were never apart. Wherever one of them went, the other would go too. They looked almost exactly alike, and the only way to tell them apart was by their eyes. Pilar's eyes were green, and Fefe's eyes were brown. The people in the village warned him that they were brujas, and told him to be careful, or they would put brujeria, otherwise known as witchcraft, onto him. But Panfilo just laughed and said he wasn't afraid. He didn't believe in witches. However, as time went by, Panfilo became curious. The old women never left their house after dark. He watched their house every evening, but as soon as night fell, he never saw them come out. Sometimes he would peer through the windows, but the house was always dark. The only thing he could see were the eyes of their cats, glittering in the darkness. The cats would hiss at him and scare him off. One night he decided to go to their house and find out what the old sisters got up to after dark. When he peered through the window, the cats weren't around. He knocked on the door, but there was no answer, so he cautiously opened the door and let himself inside. The house was empty, and there was a fire burning in the hearth. He was looking around when he noticed something glistening in front of the fire. When he bent down to see what it was, he recoiled in horror. There were 2 pairs of human eyes laying there. They looked as if they had been taken out of their sockets and left there in front of the fire to keep them warm. There was a big iron spoon standing beside the fireplace that was used to gather up the ashes. He grabbed the spoon and scooped up the eyes to take a closer look at them. The 2 pairs of eyes stared up at him. One pair was green and one pair was brown. It was almost as if the eyes were glaring at him. As he looked upon them, he began to feel sick. Panfio was very frightened, and his hands started trembling. He was shaking so much that the iron spoon tipped over, and he accidentally dumped the eyes into the fire. The eyes started to burn, then they popped and spluttered as they hit the coals, and then they began to dance. The eyes danced up and down, hissing and popping as they jumped. Panfio tried desperately to scoop them out of the fire, but it was far too late. They were so charred and burned that they looked like 4 hard, brown walnuts. Just then, 2 lean black cats came screeching into the house. They ran all around his legs, hissing at him and trying to scratch him. Panfio went from being frightened to absolutely terrified. He made the sign of the cross at the cats and ran out of there as fast as his legs would carry him. He didn't stop running until he got back to the safety of his own home. The next morning, after barely sleeping at all, Panfio was still quite afraid. He was worried that the 2 old sisters would find out what he had done. He decided to go over to their house and talk to them as if everything was normal, hoping that they wouldn't suspect him. When he knocked on the door, he heard the 2 sisters say in unison, "Come in, Panfio." He opened the door and went inside. The 2 old women were sitting in their chairs in front of the fire, warming their hands. "We're busy, Panfio," they said. "We can't play cards with you today." Panfio saw the 2 lean black cats lying on the floor, and they looked up at him and hissed. Panfio noticed that the cats didn't have any eyes. And just then, the 2 old women turned to look at him, and to his horror, he saw that they had the round eyes of the cats in the sockets where their own eyes should be. Panfio backed away and left the house. He never saw the 2 old sisters again after that. They stayed in that house day and night and never came out. Even so, Panfio made sure that he kept his doors and windows locked, and he never went outside again after dark. Hey everyone, we hope you're enjoying the story so far. We would just like to take a quick break to remind and to ask you to subscribe to the channel, like the videos, and share our content to help us get the channel views up. Alright, thank you again. Back to the stories. One evening, a teenage girl came home from school and found the house empty. Her mother had left a sticky note on the fridge for her. The note read that her father was working late, that her mother was out shopping, and that her younger brothers were at soccer practice. The girl was now alone in the house. Being a very wise young woman, the girl locked the front door, just in case. Then she put her mobile phone on the hall table, hung her keys on a hook, and went upstairs to her bedroom to change her clothes. As she was getting undressed, she saw a sticky note on her bed. She picked the sticky note up and read the message. It read, "There was someone in the house." She was a little startled by this, but she simply assumed that it was her younger brothers playing a trick on her, so she crumpled up the note and threw it into her wastebasket. "Okay, very funny guys," she said. "What happened? Did you 2 miss soccer practice?" No one answered. "Hey, I know that you're here," she yelled. "If I find out that you 2 went through my stuff again, you're dead." After changing her clothes and feeling thoroughly annoyed, the girl went downstairs to the kitchen to fix herself a snack. When she opened the refrigerator, she discovered yet another sticky note. This sticky note read, "There's nobody here but you and me." This was starting to make her feel a little bit unnerved. She crumpled the note and dropped it onto the floor, turned around and said, "Hey guys, this is not funny anymore. Knock it off." There was no answer. The girl went to the front door and tried the knob, but it was still locked. She turned around to get her keys, but the hook she had hung them on was empty. Then, the girl glanced down at the hall table, and she saw that her mobile phone had disappeared as well. And on the table, where she had placed her mobile phone, there was another sticky note. This sticky note read, "You're not going anywhere." At this point, she wasn't even sure that this was a prank anymore. She let out a scream, ran into the kitchen, and picked up the landline to call the police. There was no dial tone. She looked down and grabbed the phone line, and to her horror, she realized that it had been cut. There she saw another note lying by the phone. She read the note, terrified at seeing what it said. "No phone, no police, no way out." Trembling with fear, the girl ran to the back door. When she tried to turn the handle, she found that it was also locked, and just then she spotted another note stuck to the door. This note simply read, "Look up." As the girl slowly looked up and tilted her eyes to the ceiling, she saw her pet cat speared through the heart and pinned to the ceiling with a kitchen knife. She screamed in terror and ran to the nearest window. She tried punching and kicking it, but she couldn't smash the glass. It wouldn't even crack. And there she saw another sticky note on the bottom window pane, which read, "You can't catch a break, can you?" The frightened girl desperately tried to think of what she should do. She needed a knife to defend herself. She ran into the kitchen, but when she pulled out the drawer, it was empty. All of the knives were gone, and in their place was yet another sticky note. In all capital letters, this sticky note had written upon it the words, "Children shouldn't play with sharp things." She ran upstairs to her bedroom and locked the door. She checked inside the closet and underneath her bed. There was no one in there. She was still terrified, but she did manage to breathe a small sigh of relief. Just as soon as she had exhaled, all of a sudden, her TV turned on by itself. It was loud, and the channel was static. On the screen, she saw another note. This note read, "Now I have you where I want you." The girl flew into an absolute panic and started screaming and yelling, "Help! Help! Somebody help me! Somebody help me!" Just then, she remembered that she had her laptop computer in her room. She flipped open the lid, logged into social media, and quickly sent a message to her best friend. In all capital letters, she wrote, "Help! This is not a joke. Call the cops. There's someone in my house." Minutes later, she heard the sound of sirens outside. The police arrived and broke down her front door. 2 officers burst into her bedroom and found her cowering in the corner, shaking and quivering with fear. The police searched the entire house from top to bottom, examining every nook and cranny, but they found no one. As the officers were interviewing her, one of them spotted a sticky note attached to her back. As he pulled it off, his face went white. He turned and handed it to his partner, who then read it out loud. The note read, "I was this close." One moonless night, at the stroke of midnight, a thief slipped into the deserted courtyard and made his way to the hangman's gallows. The corpse of a murderer was dangling from the noose, twisting in the wind. The thief took a sharp knife out of his pocket, and making sure that nobody was watching, began sawing off the dead man's hand. When his grisly task was finished, the thief wrapped the severed hand in a burial shroud and stuffed it into his pocket. Then he climbed up the gibbet and cut 5 locks of hair from the dead man's head. Finally, he climbed back down and disappeared into the night. When he returned to his hideout, he began preparing the severed hand. First, he squeezed it until all the blood was gone. Next, he dipped it in animal fat and left it out to dry in the midday sun. He twisted the locks of hair into candle wicks, dipped them in wax, and allowed them to set. Then he screwed the wicks into the 4 fingers and the thumb of the dried hand. At last, the hand of glory was complete. High on the windy hills of Yorkshire, on Bowes Moor, sat the old Spital Inn. It was a stormy night in late October, 1797. The landlord and his wife were preparing for bed. The butler and the cook were locking all the doors and windows when, suddenly, they heard a loud banging at the front door. The curious little servant girl who slept in the kitchen was peering through a crack in the kitchen door. She wondered who would be visiting her master at this time of night. In the hallway, she saw her master and the butler greeting a bent and wizened old woman. She was dressed in a long cloak and a hood that obscured her face. Shivering and shaking from the cold and the rain, the beggar woman pleaded with the landlord to allow her to stay for the night. Being a generous man, the landlord told her she could spend the night on the bench in front of the fire. After the landlord, his wife, the butler, and the cook had gone to bed, the little servant girl heard noises coming from the next room. Looking through the keyhole, she saw the old woman standing up and lifting up her cloak to reveal a big pair of men's boots. Instantly, the servant girl became suspicious and decided to keep an eye on the stranger. She saw the old woman pulling off her hood to reveal the scarred and embittered face of a hardened criminal. From beneath his cloak, the thief took out a grotesque severed hand and placed it on the bench. Then he lit the stiff, bony fingers of the hand. The terrified servant girl watched in horror as she heard the thief reciting an ancient spell. All those who listen and in this house dwell, hear ye the words of the dead man's spell. Unlock every lock at the dead man's knock, and open bolt and band with the dead man's hand. Sleep all who sleep, let none here awake. Sleep like the dead, for the dead man's sake. The thief finished his incantation, and the fingers of the severed hand glowed with an intense, brilliant light. Each finger flamed, but the thumb would not light. The thief hadn't seen the little servant girl and thought there were only 4 people in the house, so he gave up trying to light the thumb. Instead, he went to the door and opened it, letting in 2 other men who were lurking outside. Gathering around the flaming hand, the thieves began murmuring over and over, "Hand of glory shining bright, lead us to our spoils tonight." While the thieves were busy filling their sacks with valuables, the frightened little servant girl tiptoed into the butler's quarters and tried to wake him up, to alert him to the danger. But no matter what she tried, she could not shake him from his deep slumber. Then she went into the cook's bedroom and tried to wake her, but it was no use. Finally, she slipped up the stairs and went into the landlord's bedroom. She found her master and his wife lying in bed, their eyes wide open, staring lifelessly into space. They seemed to be in some sort of trance. The little girl realized that the hand of glory must have cast some sort of spell over the household, so she crept down the stairs again, grabbed the flaming hand, and brought it into the kitchen. She took a deep breath and tried to blow out the burning fingers, but she couldn't extinguish them. Suddenly, she had an idea. Grabbing a jug of skimmed milk that was sitting on the table, she poured it over the top of the grotesque hand. The milk quenched the burning wicks, and the spell was broken. She was able to creep upstairs again and rouse the landlord and his wife. Then she shook the butler and the cook until they were wide awake. The landlord came running downstairs with a pistol in his hand as the cook and the butler stumbled wearily out of their rooms, rubbing their heads. They were able to surprise the thieves and force them out the front door at gunpoint. Then they slammed the door behind them and locked it. The thieves began to circle the house and banged on the windows and doors. "Give us back our hand of glory," they exclaimed. "Just give us the hand and we'll go away quietly and we'll do no harm to anyone." The landlord knew that the thieves were lying, as they were liars by nature. So he threw open his bedroom window and began firing his pistol into the darkened street. The screams and cries of the robbers echoed through the darkness as they fled into the night. In the morning, a pool of blood was found outside on the cobblestones. The little servant girl was able to identify the thieves and help the police track them down. The whole gang was caught and tried for their crimes. They were sentenced to death and hanged on the gallows until they were dead. The hand of glory was then confiscated by the police. The corpses of the thieves were left hanging from the gibbet overnight, and when the police returned in the morning, they were shocked to discover that someone had stolen in during the night and cut off all of the dead man's hands. There was once a woman who lived by herself in a quaint house in the country. Her husband had passed away about 5 years back, and she was planning on moving soon. One day, while packing up some of her husband's things, she noticed that the temperature dropped extremely low. She walked down the hall to check the thermostat, but when she got there, it showed no difference in temperature. She thought about it, but figured that it must be broken. Yet another reason she would like to leave this house. Still, she decided that she would rather repair it than to be uncomfortable, and so she thought that she would call someone the next day to fix it. When she passed the mirror on the wall on her way back, she thought that she saw a movement of shadows in the reflection. Then, strangely enough, the temperature seemed to suddenly return to normal, and when she looked back at the mirror, nothing was there. She thought that this was strange, but she shook it off and went back to packing. A couple of days later, she noticed that strangely, out of nowhere, the temperature seemed to drop again. Again, the woman went to the thermostat, and again, the thermostat showed no change. She remembered then that she had forgotten to call someone to repair it. She promised herself that she would call after she finished the show she was watching on TV. When she passed the mirror, she again saw the movement of shadows. She stopped. In the reflection, she saw a shadow. Nothing but a shadow. Slightly translucent, but visible. The shape was indescribable. It seemed to change shape, like flowing water, and it seemed to be the size of a person about 1.5 feet taller than she. It stepped out from the wall behind the woman, but when she turned around to face it, there was nothing there. Now she was scared. She began to tremble. She slowly turned back to the mirror. The figure was still there, and now even closer to her. She screamed out, "Help!" But no one came. Closer and closer, the shadow in the mirror came towards her. A few weeks later, a friend of the woman stopped by to say hello, as she had not heard from her for a while. She knocked and knocked on the front door, but there was no answer. The woman's friend found this to be a little distressing and decided to make a phone call to the police to have them show up for a welfare check. Later that evening, a police officer came by to perform the welfare check, but found nothing but a few empty boxes and the television set left on. The woman was nowhere to be found. After another 24 hours had passed, the police decided to do an investigation for a missing person. After quite some time of searching and investigating, the case was cold, and it was put down as an unsolved case. The house was soon cleaned out and put on the market for sale. For many years, the house was empty, what with all the stories going on about it. But one day, a small family from out of state, consisting of a mother, a father, and a daughter, moved into the house. All was well until one day, when the temperature dropped inside of the house. The daughter went to her parents and asked them what happened. They both said that they didn't know, and they walked to the thermostat to check it. The thermostat showed no change in temperature, and so they decided to call someone to come and take a look at it. The daughter went back to playing with her dolls in her bedroom. Had she looked up into her mirror, she would have seen a shadow peeking out from behind the reflection of her bed. But just then, her parents came in to tell her that someone was coming the next day to fix the thermostat, and that she would just have to deal with the change in temperature for a while. But just as they had finished saying this to her, the thermostat seemed to kick into gear, and the temperature went back to normal. The parents thought that it must be slightly faulty, and since it was working as of now, they told the little girl to never mind. A few weeks later, the temperature dropped again. The girl was brushing her hair at the time, in front of her mirror. She saw the shadow behind her reflection as it started to creep towards her. The little girl screamed, and her parents came running in, asking her what was wrong and what had happened. She told them about the shadow, but they didn't believe her. She tried as hard as she could to make them believe her, but it was no use. After the girl kept insisting and behaving erratically, they took her to a child psychologist to try and get her some help. After many visits, the child finally came home, and at this point, she too believed that it was all just a figment of her imagination. She probably would have kept believing that, except that about a year later, the temperature dropped once again. The girl was home by herself because her parents had gone to the theater and left her alone. She was 13 years old at this time, so her parents thought that she would be safe for a couple of hours. She was sitting in her mother's room, digging through her mother's makeup and experimenting with it in front of her mother's mirror. She stared in terror as the thing behind her reflection crept out from behind the bed. She was frozen but began to tremble and couldn't call out. Who would she call to anyway? She knew that no one would come. And now, as it had done before, the thing in the mirror came closer and closer and closer. When the girl's parents arrived home from the theater, they found the house empty. Their young daughter was nowhere to be found. At first, they called out to her and lackadaisically walked around the house looking for her. That soon became a frantic search, and then they called the police. 1 year later, another police report was marked cold as an unsolved case. The house still stands to this day, and it's still on the market if you'd like to buy it. Apparently, it's actually quite a bargain. There was a boy named Louis who really loved Halloween. It was his favorite holiday, and he always tried to celebrate it in style. Every year he would save up as much money as he could, and he would try to buy the best mask, the best costume, and the best decorations. This year was no different. Louis was getting ready to go to a Halloween party at his friend's house. He got dressed up in a shaggy black coat, big black boots, and a long flowing cape. Then he put on his Halloween mask and admired his creation in the mirror. This was the scariest, most hideous mask that he had ever seen. He was sure that everyone at the party would be terrified when they set their eyes on it. He would be the envy of all of his friends. When Louis turned up at his friend's house, the party was already in full swing. He could hear the dull sound of music coming from behind the door. He rang the doorbell and his friend answered it. She greeted him, recoiled in fear just a bit, and then ushered him inside. Louis walked around the living room. Some people were dancing, and others were talking, laughing, drinking, and nibbling at the buffet. There were witches, ghosts, skeletons, vampires, and zombies. None of the other masks were very scary. Louis was sure that he had the best one. He stood there and waited for someone to comment on his mask, but nobody paid any attention to him. He was disappointed. Wandering around the room, he tried to give everyone a good view of the mask. He wanted them to be scared. He wanted to cause a stir. One girl finally tapped him on the shoulder and started talking to him. "Hey, who are you supposed to be?" she asked. Louis tried to reply, but he found he couldn't move his mouth. The mask suddenly felt too tight. He started to get embarrassed, so he turned away and went into the kitchen to get himself a glass of punch. He tried to pull off his mask so he could take a drink, but it wouldn't budge. It seemed to be stuck fast to his face. He pulled and he tugged on it, but no matter what he did, he couldn't get it off. At this point, Louis was starting to panic. It was getting really hot inside the house, and Louis could feel himself sweating underneath the mask. He needed to get this mask off, and he needed to get it off now. Grabbing a knife from the kitchen drawer, he went into the restroom and locked the door behind him. He looked in the mirror and started scratching and tearing at the mask, but it really hurt. It was as if the mask was firmly stuck to his skin. As Louis began to get more desperate, he took the knife and sliced into the mask, cutting off little strips of rubber and tossing them into the sink. Gradually, as Louis was in the bathroom for quite some time, a line began to form outside, and people started getting impatient. They began knocking on the door and calling out, "What's going on in there? Come on, we need to use the bathroom. Get out of there." Louis was in a panic, and he tried peeling off the rest of the mask, but it stubbornly stayed in place. He could not understand what was going on. What if it won't ever come off? He wondered. What if it's stuck on my face forever? Out of panic and frustration, he began hacking at the mask with a knife and ripping off little bits. The crowd outside of the door began banging on the door more often, and their shouts were becoming more filled with frustration. "Come on! Hey! What are you doing in there?" they shouted. From inside of the bathroom, they could hear Louis shrieking, "It won't come off! It won't come off! My mask! It won't come off!" The people gathered outside of the restroom began to give each other worried looks. One of the girls was puzzled. "Mask?" she said. "But he wasn't wearing a mask." There were two young girls named Emma and Veronica who lived on the same street. It was Halloween night, and Emma's parents had gone away for the weekend. She was a little nervous about being on her own in the house overnight, so she invited her friend Veronica over to keep her company. The girls planned to have a sleepover. During the day, they swapped clothes and did each other's hair and nails. In the evening, they ordered a pizza and watched a horror movie. Now and then, a group of kids would ring the doorbell and yell, "Trick or treat!" The two girls had fun handing out all of the Halloween candy. Afterwards, the girls spent a long time chatting and gossiping about the other kids at their school. Before they knew it, it was past midnight. The girls were both very tired, so they decided it was time to go to sleep. Emma got into her own bed, while Veronica had to sleep on a futon on the floor. The room was completely silent, and Emma was gradually drifting off to sleep. Just then, Veronica sat up and began shaking her friend. "Come on, let's go downstairs and get some ice cream," she said loudly. Emma was very sleepy and muttered, "I'm not hungry." "Well, I am," replied Veronica. "Come on, let's go downstairs." Emma turned over in her bed. "There's no ice cream in the freezer," she moaned drowsily. "We ate it all." "Then let's go to the store and buy some more," said Veronica. "I don't want any," mumbled her friend. You can go on your own if you want ice cream." "No, it's not safe to walk alone at night," Veronica whined. "Come on, let's go." Emma lay in bed and tried to ignore her. "Please, Emma," Veronica started crying. "Please, I really want some ice cream." Inexplicably, tears were streaming down her face. Emma was exasperated. She was sick and tired of listening to her friend whine. "OMG, Veronica! Okay, she shouted. "If it's that important to you, then I'll go to the shop with you. Just calm down." The girls quickly got dressed and put on their coats. As soon as they left the house, however, Veronica grabbed her friend's hand and started dragging her in the opposite direction. "Veronica, what are you doing? This isn't the way to the store," said Emma. "Shh! Shush!" hissed Veronica. "We're going to the police station." When I was starting to go to sleep, I looked in the mirror and I saw that there was a man with an axe hiding underneath your bed. There was a little girl named Holly who had just turned 6 years old. One night, her parents decided to celebrate their wedding anniversary by going out to a nice restaurant for dinner. Because it was a spur-of-the-moment decision, they had some trouble finding a babysitter for their daughter. Eventually, they called the teenage daughter of a friend whose name was Jessica, who lived down the street, and asked her if she could babysit for them. Jessica agreed and checked with her parents, who also agreed to allow the girl to babysit. When Jessica arrived at their house, the parents gave her their mobile phone number and told her to call them if there was an emergency. After they left, the babysitter fixed Holly some dinner and then sat down on the sofa to watch TV. When Holly had finished eating dinner, she asked Jessica if she could have some dessert. Jessica replied, "Okay, well, what would you like?" "Ice cream," said Holly, smiling from ear to ear. The babysitter then got up and searched through the fridge. "I can't find any ice cream in here," she said. "Oh, it's in the freezer in the basement," said Holly. Jessica opened the basement door and flicked on the light switch, but the lights didn't turn on. She carefully made her way down the creaking steps into the basement. Using only the light that was coming from the door upstairs, she eventually found the freezer and lifted the lid. As she took out a tub of vanilla ice cream, she happened to glance out of one of the basement windows. In the darkness, she saw a little girl with long blonde hair standing outside. The girl had a red t-shirt on and was standing with her back to the window. Jessica couldn't see her face, but she noticed that the little girl was wearing something black on her head. This scared the babysitter, but she didn't pay much attention. There were a lot of houses in the neighborhood and a lot of children who loved to play outside during the night. Jessica made her way back upstairs, put some ice cream in a bowl, and placed it in front of Holly. The little girl smiled and then scrunched up her face. "Can I have some chocolate syrup on it?" she asked. "Okay, well, where's that at?" asked Jessica. "That's in the basement too," replied the child. Jessica dutifully made her way back down into the darkened basement. As she was searching for the chocolate syrup, she glanced out the window again. The little girl was still standing outside, but this time she was facing the window. Jessica saw that she was wearing an unusual mask. It was black with red trim, and the mouth was covered in large, sharp, white teeth. It gave Jessica the creeps. The babysitter found and retrieved the chocolate syrup and walked back up the creaking stairs. In the kitchen, she poured the chocolate syrup on Holly's ice cream. "Thank you," said Holly. "Can I have some candy sprinkles on it too?" "Let me guess, they're in the basement." "Yeah," giggled Holly. The babysitter headed back down the stairs one more time into the darkened basement. As she rifled through the cabinets, she looked out the window and saw the same little girl in the mask standing outside. This time, the child was holding a large knife in her hand. Jessica became very uneasy. She tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was part of this weird costume that the little girl was wearing. However, it seemed odd to her that any child's parents would allow her to go around at night armed with a knife. Shaking it off and shuddering, Jessica finally found the candy sprinkles and ran up the stairs, taking them 2 by 2, anxious to get out of the basement. "Thank you!" squealed Holly happily as the babysitter shook the candy sprinkles onto her ice cream. "All it needs now is a cherry on top." Jessica stared at Holly with irritation. "Are you sure that's all it needs? This is the last time I'm going down into that basement." "I promise that's all it needs," Holly said as she grinned at the babysitter. Jessica then slowly descended into the darkness and decided for her, no matter what Holly wanted, this would be her final trip down. She opened the cabinet and immediately found the cherries. As she closed the cabinet, she looked up and out the window, and she noticed that there was no sign of the creepy little girl in the mask. Jessica then breathed a sigh of relief. She was glad that the girl was gone. That whole situation was kind of beginning to freak her out a little bit. She picked up the jar of cherries and she climbed the stairs for the last time. As she entered the kitchen, she was greeted by a horrible sight. Holly lay face down in her bowl of ice cream. A pool of blood was spreading out around her on the table. Her soft little throat had been sliced open. Jessica screamed and dropped the jar of cherries. They exploded onto the floor. She ran into the bathroom and locked the door behind her and began to call 911. She sat on the floor, tears streaming down her cheeks, panicking and desperately waiting for the police to arrive. After what seemed like an hour, she heard sirens outside and heard the sounds of the front door being pounded on before being broken down. Right then, a policeman's voice called out, identifying himself, and Jessica jumped up and unlocked the bathroom door. The police then took her outside and went back in and searched the entire house, but there was no trace of any intruder. A few minutes later, Holly's mother and father arrived back at the home. They were horrified to see their young daughter's corpse being carried out on a stretcher. The father sat on the steps outside, his head cradled in his hands, rocking back and forth. The tearful mother approached Jessica. Her eyes were red from crying. She grabbed Jessica and began to shake her, frantically screaming, "What happened? What happened?" "Oh my God, I am so sorry," said Jessica, trembling with emotion. "I was down in the basement. I looked out the window, and there was a little girl in the mask. She had a knife, and she was just standing there outside the basement window. She must have murdered Holly." "But Jessica, that's impossible," said the mother. "There aren't any windows in the basement. There's only a mirror." Jennifer was sitting at the desk in her bedroom, finishing up her homework. She had an exam the next day and needed to study. As she was searching for one of her school books, she received a text message on her phone. She didn't recognize the number, but the text read, "Take a bubble bath and go to bed. It's a school night. Mom." "Oh, she's probably out of service and had to text me from someone else's phone," thought Jennifer. She had already been planning to take a nice, relaxing bubble bath soon anyway, so she undressed, grabbed a clean towel, and walked into the bathroom. She stopped in her tracks, surprised. The bathtub had already been filled to the brim. That's strange," she thought. "I guess Mom must have filled it in advance." Throwing caution to the wind and not thinking much about the scenario, Jennifer shrugged her shoulders, dropped the towel, and climbed into the bath. Her whole body was submerged before she became aware of a burning sensation all over her skin. Within seconds, the burning sensation got worse and worse until she was screaming out in agony. She jumped out of the bath, but it was too late. To her horror, she saw that the water in the bathtub was turning red, blood red. The skin on her arms and legs was beginning to peel off. She looked at her leg, and the skin there was peeling off too. Then her chest and her stomach began to peel. All the skin on her body was coming off. Pieces of her skin fell to the floor, and she started screaming in pain. As she stood there, her skin sliding off and blood pouring out of her and puddling around her feet on the bathroom floor. As Jennifer was in complete agony, it took everything she could muster to open the bathroom door and hobble outside into the hallway. She made her way to the bedroom. Every step was agony. She left a bloody trail all along the carpet. She picked up her cell phone to dial 911, but there was a new text message waiting for her. The message read, "Next time, bathe in water." Jennifer heard laughter behind her and turned around to find a tall man dressed in black standing in the doorway. He was holding a jagged knife in one hand and stretching his arm out to her, showing off an empty jar of sulfuric acid. Hey everyone, thank you for showing up and listening. We hope that you've enjoyed Terrifying Tales Volume 1. There's going to be some more installments in this series. We really enjoy this short format of scary campfire-style tales that are suitable for adults, but are also not too scary for older children or younger teens, depending on what kind of media they're allowed to partake in. Please remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel. If you feel like commenting, we always try to interact with every comment that's left. We'll see you next week, and we hope that you enjoy the next episode that we bring you. Until then, take care of yourselves and have sweet dreams.